My name is Eleanor Frances Hutchinson, born Eleanor Frances Garrett, and I entered this world on the 23rd of November in the year 1849 in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, in a small house on Woodland Avenue that has long since been torn down to make room for commercial buildings. I am now in my 81st year, and I have been asked to give an account of my life for the historical record. I will do so with an honesty I could not have managed in earlier years, for there is a certain freedom that comes with very old age. One stops caring what others may think, and one begins to understand that carrying secrets to the grave helps no one, least of all the dead, who are beyond caring whether we speak kindly or poorly of them. I wish to speak about a decision I made on the 14th of March, 1889, when I was 39 years old. It was not a choice I thought about for a long time, nor was it one I made with full understanding of what would follow. It was a choice made quickly under strain, with incomplete knowledge and too little courage. Yet it was the most important decision of my life, and I have carried its burden for 41 years with a steadiness that suggests it will follow me to my own grave, which cannot now be very far away. On that day in March of 1889, I received a telegram at my home in Detroit, Michigan. The message was from a physician at Cleveland City Hospital, a man I had never met, telling me that my mother, Rebecca Garrett, had been admitted to the charity ward 3 days earlier in critical condition. He wrote that she was not expected to live more than a few days, and that if I wished to see her before she died, I should come at once. I did not go. My mother died 4 days later, on the 18th of March, 1889, in that hospital, alone except for the nurses who worked in the charity ward and the strangers dying in the beds beside her. She was 67 years old, and I, her only living child, was 250 miles away in Detroit, attending to my household and my 4 young children. I had made the calculation that I could not afford, in practical, financial, or emotional terms, to travel to Cleveland to witness my mother's death. I have spent 41 years trying to justify that choice to myself, and I have failed. I will now try to explain it to whoever may hear this account, not to seek forgiveness, which I do not deserve, but to offer an honest explanation of how such a thing can happen, how a daughter leaves her mother to die alone, and then spends the rest of her life unable to pardon herself for doing so. Before I can explain that choice, I must describe my relationship with my mother and the history between us. It was not simple, and its complexity bears directly upon what I did and did not do in March of 1889. I was born in Cleveland in 1849 to Rebecca Garrett, who was then unmarried and 27 years old. The identity of my father was never revealed to me, and I do not know to this day whether my mother knew who he was or simply refused to name him. What I do know is that I was born illegitimate, that this fact shaped my mother's life and mine in ways that cannot be overstated, and that the shame and hardship it created influenced every part of our relationship from my earliest memories. My mother supported us by working as a seamstress, taking in piecework and sewing garments for the wives of Cleveland's more prosperous families. We lived in a series of rented rooms in neighborhoods that grew poorer as my mother's health and earning strength declined with age. We were poor, not in the dramatic sense of starving in the streets, but in the steady, exhausting way of never quite having enough. Not enough food, not enough warmth, not enough safety, not enough hope that things might improve. My mother was a stern woman, made harder by the circumstances that had brought me into the world and the long years of labor that followed. She was not gentle. She did not show affection in any way I could recognize. She was almost always angry at the world, at her situation, at the respectable women whose dresses she stitched, and at me for existing and making her life more difficult than it might have been. I do not remember her ever touching me with softness or speaking to me with warmth. What I remember is criticism, complaint, and resentment expressed in countless small ways every day. The air in our home was heavy with restrained anger. My mother would sit at her sewing, her needle moving with steady precision, while she muttered about the women who ordered the dresses, how long they took to choose fabrics, how they argued about prices, how they lived comfortably while she worked her fingers raw. She would complain about our landlords, about the poor quality of lamp oil, about the rising cost of bread, about the noise from neighboring rooms, and she would complain about me, that I was awkward with my stitching, that I ate too much, that I outgrew my clothes too quickly, that I existed as a constant reminder of her ruined life. I learned very early not to cry or show pain when she spoke that way. Tears only made her more irritated, as if I were accusing her of cruelty when she believed she was only speaking the truth. So I developed a certain inner hardness, an ability to hear her sharp words without outward reaction, to absorb her anger without returning it. This protected me in childhood, but it harmed me in ways I did not understand until much later, when I found myself unable to accept kindness from Thomas or to show tenderness to my own children. There were rare moments when my mother would speak of her life before I was born. She had been, she told me, a fairly attractive young woman with the possibility of a respectable marriage. She had worked in a draper's shop in Cleveland, earning decent wages, living with her parents, expecting an ordinary future, and then something had happened. She never explained what, though I could guess. She found herself pregnant and unmarried. Her parents cast her out. The man responsible disappeared, and her entire life collapsed into poverty and isolation. She told me these things not to help me understand her, but to make certain I understood that I had destroyed her life. She would say, I could have married. I could have had a proper family, a home, security. Instead, I have this, gesturing to our single room and our few possessions, and I have you, which is the cause of it all. She said it without much anger, simply as a fact, which made it worse than if she had shouted. I understood from these talks that I was meant to feel gratitude for her sacrifice in keeping me rather than leaving me at an orphanage, or worse. And I did feel gratitude, or what I thought was gratitude, though it was mixed with such deep resentment that the two feelings became tangled together. I was thankful she had not abandoned me, but I also resented her for making sure I knew how much my existence had cost her and how little I could ever repay that cost. Our poverty was not extreme for that time. We always had some shelter, some food, some way to survive, but it was constant and exhausting, a steady knowledge of not having enough. We wore the same clothing until it was beyond repair. We ate simple meals, bread, potatoes, and sometimes meat, when my mother finished a particularly well-paid order. We moved often, always to cheaper rooms in worse buildings, our few belongings becoming more worn with each move. Through all of it my mother sewed and I sewed beside her. Our fingers formed permanent calluses, our eyes strained from detailed work in poor light, our backs aching from long hours bent over fabric. Even as a child, I understood that my mother believed her life had been ruined by my birth, and that she could not look at me without recalling that ruin. I was the living proof of her shame, the reason she could not marry respectably, the weight that kept her poor and alone. She did not say this plainly, but it was present in the constant bitterness that filled our home. I attended school irregularly, sewing beside my mother whenever my work was required, which was often. By the time I was 12 in 1861, I could sew as skillfully as most grown women. The war began that year, and it brought greater demand for sewing. Uniforms, bandages, shirts for soldiers. My mother and I worked long hours to meet that need, our fingers always sore, our eyes tired from close work by dim lamplight. The war years were, in a limited way, better for us. We were never comfortable, but we had more work than we could finish, and more money than before. My mother saved what she could, hoping to gather enough to open a small shop of her own, though this hope never came to pass. The work never stopped, the hours were harsh, and my schooling ended when I was 13 in 1862 because my mother needed my labor more than my education. When I was 18 years old in 1867, I met Thomas Hutchinson. He was a cabinet maker from Detroit, visiting relatives in Cleveland. He was 24, steady in his trade, with reliable income and respectable prospects. He was not especially handsome, but he was gentle and gentleness was something I had known so little that I found it remarkable. He courted me for 3 months during his extended stay in Cleveland. When he returned to Detroit, he asked me to marry him and go there with him. I accepted at once, without hesitation and without asking my mother's opinion. Marriage to Thomas meant escape from poverty, from endless sewing, from my mother's bitterness, from Cleveland and all it held. Thomas knew I was illegitimate. I told him because I believed he had the right to know the truth before binding his life to mine. He said I had a right to understand what he was accepting by choosing to marry me. He told me it made no difference to him that I bore no blame for the circumstances of my birth, that he judged me only by my own conduct and character. Such generosity overwhelmed me, and I loved him for it with a deep gratitude that carried our marriage through many difficult years. My mother's reaction to my engagement was not what I had expected. I had thought she would be glad that I was marrying a respectable tradesman who could provide for me properly. Instead, she was furious. She said I was deserting her, that I was leaving her alone, after she had given up everything to raise me. She called me ungrateful and selfish. She declared that if I left Cleveland to marry Thomas, she would consider me dead to her. I married Thomas in April of 1868 and moved to Detroit. My mother did not come to the wedding. I left Cleveland with my few belongings and an enormous sense of relief that after 18 years I was finally escaping the burden of my mother's resentment and the poverty we had endured together. For the first few years of my marriage, I had almost no communication with my mother. I wrote to her now and then, brief letters telling her about my situation, my pregnancies, the births of my children. She never answered. I sent her money when we were able to spare it, small sums that Thomas and I could afford without harming our own household. I do not know whether she received those payments or if she even acknowledged them. There was only silence from Cleveland. At first, that silence felt like a relief. I had freed myself from my mother's bitterness, and I did not wish to bring it back into my life through letters. But as the years went by and the silence continued, it began to trouble me in ways I did not fully understand. I would wonder if my mother was well, if she was managing on her own, if she ever thought of me at all. Beneath those practical worries lay a deeper confusion about what I owed her. Did duty as a daughter require me to keep writing even when she would not reply? Was I abandoning her by accepting her silence? Or was I simply respecting her decision to cut me off? Before we continue, a brief word. I have released 14 complete recordings that will never appear on YouTube. These are stories too personal and too raw to share publicly, entirely unedited, with nothing removed. If you wish to hear them, the link is in the description. It is called The Lost Recordings, and purchasing it helps us continue making these videos. Now back to the story. I spoke with Thomas once or twice about this matter, asking whether he believed I should make stronger efforts to reach my mother, or perhaps travel to Cleveland to see her. His answer never changed. My mother had made her decision when she refused to attend our wedding, and when she ignored my letters. I had my own family to care for, and I should not trouble myself over a woman who had chosen estrangement. It sounded reasonable, and I accepted it. Yet it did not completely calm my uneasiness. The truth, which I did not admit even to myself then, was that I was relieved by my mother's silence, because it freed me from obligation, while still allowing me to appear as though I had tried. I could tell myself I had attempted to preserve the connection, that my mother had rejected those efforts, and that I carried no blame for the separation. This was comfortable, and I did not look at it too closely. During the 21 years between my marriage in 1868 and my mother's death in 1889, I thought of her less and less. When my children were small and demanding, I sometimes caught myself speaking to them with an impatience that reminded me painfully of my own mother, and I would promise myself to be kinder, though I did not always succeed. When my daughters Mary and Catherine died, I would think of my mother and wonder whether she even knew she had granddaughters and whether she grieved for them. But those thoughts were brief. For the most part, my mother became someone who belonged to my past, rather than a living presence in my present. I told myself this was natural, that children grow up, create their own families, and inevitably become distant from their parents. But the truth was that I had not simply grown distant. I had deliberately avoided thinking about her because to think about her meant facing questions I did not wish to answer. Did I love her? Had I ever truly loved her? Did she love me? Had she ever loved me? What did I owe a mother who had raised me with such open resentment? And what did she owe a daughter she had made feel unwanted? These questions offered no comforting answers, so I avoided them altogether. By the time I received the telegram in March of 1889, my mother had been absent from my life for nearly 2 decades. I had not seen her since I left Cleveland in 1868. I had no clear understanding of her present circumstances, where she lived, how she supported herself, whether she had companions, whether she was healthy or failing. The telegram from the hospital was the first definite news I had received in years, and it came not as an update on her life, but as notice that our death was near. Thomas and I had 7 children in the 12 years after our marriage. Robert in 1869, William in 1871, Mary in 1873, James in 1875, Sarah in 1879, and Catherine in 1881. Of those 7, 5 lived to adulthood. We lost Mary to diphtheria when she was 4 in 1877, and we lost Catherine to scarlet fever when she was 3 in 1884. By 1889, when the telegram arrived about my mother, I had 5 living children. Robert was 20, and apprenticed in his father's trade. William was 18 and also an apprentice. James was 14, Sarah was 12, and Elizabeth was 10. Robert and William no longer needed my constant supervision, but the 3 younger children did, and the work of the household never ended. Cooking, cleaning, washing, mending, all the labor that defined a working-class wife's life in that time. Thomas was a good provider and generally a kind husband, but he was also a man of his era. He expected his wife to manage the home and children without asking for his help. His work as a cabinet maker kept him busy from early morning until evening. When he came home, he expected dinner ready, the house in order, the children under control. He was not cruel, but he was not especially sympathetic to any struggle I might have in meeting these expectations. When the telegram arrived on March 14th, 1889, I was already dealing with a crisis at home. Elizabeth had developed a fever the previous day, and I feared it might be the beginning of scarlet fever, the same illness that had taken Catherine 5 years earlier. The telegram was delivered in the middle of the morning. I opened it and read its short, formal message about my mother's condition and her likely death. My first reaction was not sorrow, but panic, followed almost at once by a kind of paralysis that left me unable to think clearly. I stood in my kitchen, holding the telegram, knowing I should be making quick decisions about travel, yet I found myself unable to decide what those plans would require, or whether they were even possible. The practical difficulties were real. Cleveland was 250 miles from Detroit. The journey would mean taking a train, which would cost money we did not easily have, and would consume most of a day in each direction. I would have to arrange care for the 3 younger children, especially Elizabeth in her illness. I would need Thomas's consent to go, and his agreement to provide the money and manage the household while I was gone. I would have to pack suitable clothing for a deathbed visit and likely funeral, and I would have to do all of this immediately, within hours rather than days, because the telegram stated my mother was not expected to live long. These practical matters filled my thoughts that day. But beneath them was another feeling, a resentment I could not openly admit, yet which colored every consideration. My mother had chosen to remove herself from my life for 21 years. She had ignored my letters, refused to acknowledge my children, maintained a separation she herself created, and now, at the end of her life, she required me to abandon everything, spend money we could hardly spare, leave my sick child and my duties, and travel 250 miles to stand at her deathbed. The unfairness of it felt immense. I showed the telegram to Thomas that evening, expecting, and if I am honest, hoping, that he would say I could not go. And he did say exactly that. He told me we could not afford the expense. He reminded me that the children needed me, especially Elizabeth in her sickness. He said, my mother had made her decision long ago and that I owed her nothing. He said all the things I wished to hear, granting me permission to do what I already wanted, which was to remain at home and avoid the confrontation that a final visit would bring, like telegram that same evening, a short message saying I could not come because of family responsibilities. I did not explain further. I did not express regret or grief. I stated the fact and nothing more, and I told myself I had chosen the only sensible course. For the next 4 days, I tried to carry on as usual while waiting for news of my mother's death. I cared for Elizabeth, whose fever broke on the 2nd day, easing my fear of scarlet fever. I kept up with the housework, prepared meals, cleaned, and fulfilled my daily tasks, attempting not to picture my mother in Cleveland, 250 miles away, asking for me while I remained deliberately absent. But I did picture it. I thought of it constantly, and with each passing day, the weight of that choice settled more heavily upon me. With each passing day, the burden of what I was doing, or more accurately, what I was failing to do, grew heavier on my heart. By the 4th day, I found myself almost wishing the 2nd telegram would never arrive, hoping somehow that my mother might recover and the emergency would fade, so I would not have to face the final reality of her death happening without me beside her. My first reaction was not sorrow but fear. The thought of traveling to Cleveland, arranging care for the children, securing Thomas's permission and the money for the trip, making such a long journey alone, watching my mother die, and handling whatever burial arrangements would be necessary felt crushing in its practical difficulty. Beneath that practical fear there was another feeling. Resentment. Resentment that my mother, failing, who had removed herself from my life for 21 years by her own decision, who had never recognized my children or shown interest in my life after I left Cleveland, was now calling for me to stand at her deathbed. I showed the telegram to Thomas when he came home that evening. I explained everything and asked if he believed I should travel to Cleveland. His answer was quick and certain. He said I should not go. He explained that we could not afford the cost of the journey. He reminded me that the children needed me at home, especially with Elizabeth still unwell. He said my mother had made her choice when she cut contact with me, and that I owed her nothing now. He added that if I left for Cleveland, I would be neglecting my duties to my own family, and that my children's well-being must come before my mother's death. I accepted Thomas's decision without protest because it matched what I secretly wished to hear, that I was justified in staying, that circumstances prevented me from going, that I was making the right choice by placing my living children above my dying mother. I sent a telegram in reply to the physician at Cleveland City Hospital saying that I could not come because of family responsibilities in Detroit, and asking to be informed when my mother passed away. 4 days later, on March 18th, I received the 2nd telegram stating that Rebecca Garrett had died that morning. It also said that my mother had remained conscious and clear-minded until shortly before her death, and that she had repeatedly asked for her daughter Eleanor to come. For 41 years, I have tried to escape the meaning of those words. Repeatedly asked for her daughter Eleanor to come. I have told myself that she did not truly mean it, that she was confused, that even if she called for me it was only out of fear of dying, and not because she truly wished to see me. But I know these are stories I tell myself to soften the truth. The truth is that my mother wanted me there, and I was absent, and she died knowing I chose not to come. After her death, I learned from the hospital that she had been living in growing poverty in Cleveland, that she had worked as a seamstress until he all failed completely, that she had been alone when she collapsed, and that neighbors had taken her to the charity hospital, and that she had no money for burial. The hospital arranged a pauper's burial in the Cleveland Municipal Cemetery, without a marker, and without anyone present who knew her. I did not travel to Cleveland for the burial, because there was no service to attend. Charity cases were placed in common graves without ceremony. I did not visit her grave because I could not find it. Such burials were not individually marked. I sent money to the hospital to settle her small debts, and then I tried to place the entire matter behind me and continue living. But I could not leave it behind. The knowledge that I had allowed my mother to die alone that she had spent her final days in a charity ward calling my name while I remained in Detroit, caring for my household, has stayed in my mind for 41 years. The guilt appeared in ways I had not expected. I would wake in the night certain I had heard my mother calling to me. I would see women of her age in the street and feel sharp pain in my chest at the similarity. I would sit in church and find myself unable to focus on the sermon because I was wondering whether my mother had received spiritual comfort before she died, or whether she left this world angry and without peace. I became anxious about my own children's safety, afraid that I would be punished for abandoning my mother by losing one of them. When Sarah developed a cough that lasted several weeks the winter after my mother's death, I was sure it would become consumption and that God was taking revenge for my failure. When James injured his hand in an accident at the factory where he worked part-time, I saw it as divine punishment. These thoughts were unreasonable, yet I could not stop them. Thomas noticed how I had changed. He could hardly fail to see it way. And I woke breathless from nightmares several times each week, but he did not understand the cause. He believed I was simply grieving in a normal way, and encouraged me to accept that death is natural and that I had made the right choice by not disturbing our family to witness it. His kind reassurances only deepened my loneliness, because I could not tell him that I was not mourning my mother's death, but my own failure to be present for it. I tried to speak indirectly with our minister, asking about a daughter's duty and whether she must always attend her mother's deathbed, or whether practical barriers could excuse her absence. He said that God understands human weakness, that we must weigh different responsibilities, that I should not trouble myself over decisions made honestly in hard circumstances. His words, like Thomas's, brought no peace, because he did not know that I had not acted with pure intention, that I had desired an excuse to remain, that my choice had been shaped as much by bitterness as by necessity. As years passed, the sharp pain faded into a steady, dull ache that I learned to carry without letting it destroy me. I raised my children, kept my house, supported Thomas in his work, and took part in church and community life. I fulfilled these roles adequately, yet part of my mind was always occupied with what I had done. That awareness colored everything. I could not accept forgiveness for even small mistakes. If I ruined a meal, forgot an appointment, or spoke harshly to one of my children, I punished myself severely, because each small failure reminded me of the great one in March of 1889. Thomas would say, I judged myself too harshly, that everyone errs, that I should show myself more mercy. But I could not, because I believed I had committed a fault so deep that no success elsewhere could balance it. I also found it impossible to remain angry with anyone, for long. When neighbors or acquaintances hurt or treated me unfairly, I would first feel wounded or indignant. Then I would remember my mother and think, I let my mother die alone. What right do I have to resent anyone when I committed such a sin? My anger would collapse into guilty acceptance, as though I had no moral authority to judge others. This inability to set limits affected my relationships with my children as they grew older. I could not correct them when they spoke unkindly because I felt I deserved whatever coldness they showed. When Robert and his wife left me out of family gatherings, I accepted it quietly. When Sarah asked me to care for her children for weeks at a time without offering payment or even thanks, I agreed without protest. I could not defend myself or insist on basic respect because I believed I had surrendered that right by what I did in 1889. I have tried to understand why I chose, as I did, beyond the financial and practical reasons Thomas gave. Part of it was bitterness. My mother had been harsh and distant during my childhood, had made me feel unwanted, had cut me off when I married, and had ignored my life for 2 decades. Part of it was simple exhaustion. I was managing a home and 5 children with little help, and the thought of adding my mother's death to my burdens felt impossible. Part of it was fear. I feared seeing death. I feared the feelings it would awaken and the confrontation that might occur if she was still conscious when I arrived. But the deepest truth, which I have admitted to myself only in recent years, is that I did not go because I did not wish to forgive my mother I knew that if I stood beside her bed, forgiveness would be expected. Deathbed reconciliations were the custom, the Christian duty, what daughters were meant to do. And I did not want to forgive her for the cold and bitter childhood she gave me, for making me feel like a burden, for casting me aside when I married. I wanted to hold my resentment as a shield against any duty toward her, so I stayed away and she died without hearing my forgiveness. I have carried that lack of forgiveness and the guilt born from it ever since. What I have slowly come to understand over these 41 years is that the refusal to forgive bound me more tightly than her coldness ever did. Years later, I have realized that my refusal to forgive my mother hurt me far more than it ever hurt her. She died never knowing that I had held back my forgiveness, never knowing that my bitterness kept me away from her bedside. The holding back changed nothing for her, but it changed everything for me, condemning me to long decades of guilt and self-reproach that have damaged my ability to feel peace or true contentment. By refusing to forgive her, I punished myself, and that punishment has never truly stopped. I have also come to see that my mother, hard and resentful as she often seemed, carried heavy burdens that I did not fully understand when I was young. She was a woman broken by circumstances she did not choose. She was made pregnant and then abandoned, turned away by her family, forced to raise a child alone in poverty, while facing the cruel social judgment placed upon unmarried mothers in those times. She worked until she was worn out just to keep us fed and sheltered. She never married again or found companionship, because no respectable man wished to marry a woman who had an illegitimate child. She grew old alone, her health declining, her fingers too swollen with arthritis to continue the sewing that had supported us for years, and she ended her life in a charity ward because she had no savings and no family willing to care for her. I did not create those conditions, but I also did not ease them once I was able. After I married Thomas and Minbie gave to Detroit, I sent small sums of money now and then, but I did not make any serious effort to improve my mother's situation or to bring her into my home where she might have known some safety in her final years. I told myself it was because she had cut me off, because she chose silence, because after the harsh childhood she gave me I owed her nothing. But the truth is simpler and harder. I could have done more, and I chose not to. That decision played a part in her dying alone and poor. Over many years I have learned something about guilt. It does not fade through explanation or careful reasoning. I can list many reasons why I did not go to my mother's deathbed. The obstacles were real. Thomas truly opposed the trip. Elizabeth was genuinely ill. The cost of travel was heavy for us. My mother's 21 years of silence had created true distance between us. All these reasons are factually correct. Yet none of them make the guilt lighter, because guilt does not answer to logic. It remains because it is the voice of conscience, recognizing that a deep duty or love has been broken. No explanation changes the fact that the breaking happened. I failed in the duty a daughter owes her mother. No matter how difficult she was or how justified my anger felt, I allowed her to die alone after she asked for me. That fact has stayed fixed for 41 years, no matter how often I have tried to reason it away. Many times I have imagined what I might have said if I had traveled to Cleveland in March of 1889 and found her awake and able to speak. Would I have told her I forgave her for the harsh childhood? Would she have told me she forgave me for leaving and building a life without her? Could we have reached some imperfect peace that would have comforted her in her final hours and given me peace in the years that followed? I will never know. I chose not to go, and that choice removed forever the chance for such words. The dead cannot be reconciled with. Forgiveness not offered before death cannot be given afterwards. The door closed on March 18th, 1889, when my mother drew her last breath in that charity ward, and it has never opened again. I have also wondered whether her request for me near the end came from real desire to see me, or simply from the natural fear of dying alone. Perhaps she asked for me not out of love or a wish to heal our bond, but because I was her only child and she did not want strangers around her at the end. Maybe her repeated calls for her daughter, Eleanor, were less about affection and more about fear. Yet this thought changes nothing. Whether her wish came from love or from loneliness, I did not answer it. A daughter with true compassion would have gone no matter the reason behind the call. I did not go, which means either I lacked that compassion or I let resentment and self-protection silence it. In either case, the failure belongs to me. In my old age, I have also asked myself whether I would have been able to forgive her even if I had stood by her bed. Forgiveness is not just words spoken in a quiet room. It is the real letting go of anger and the choice not to hold another person's wrongs against them. I am not sure I could have done that in 1889, or even at many points afterward. I guarded my anger for years. It felt like the only justice I possessed. I could not undo my childhood, but I could keep my resentment alive as proof that I had been hurt. Letting it go would have felt like saying her treatment of me was acceptable, which it was not. What I did not understand until very late is that resentment mainly injures the one who carries it. My mother suffered little from my anger except through my absence after marriage, and she herself had chosen silence by ignoring my letters. The person most wounded by my bitterness was me. It kept me from finding peace about my beginnings, and it kept me away from her deathbed, which has filled the rest of my life with guilt. If I had understood this in 1889, perhaps I would have gone to Cleveland despite the cost, despite Thomas's resistance, despite my own fear. Perhaps I might have forgiven her, or at least given her the comfort of my presence. Perhaps I would have lived these past 41 years without this steady weight pressing on my heart. But I did not understand then. I made the choice I made, and I have lived with what followed. Thomas died in 1912 at 68, struck suddenly by a stroke while working in his shop. We had shared 44 years of marriage. Of our 5 children who lived past infancy, 4 are still alive. William survived the war only to die in the influenza epidemic of 1918. Robert, James, Sarah, and Elizabeth have families and have settled into their different lives. I am now 81 years old. I have outlived my husband by 18 years and my mother by 41. I have grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I have seen the new century begin, the rise of the automobile, the Great War, and women given the vote. Yet none of these events has reduced the weight of what I did in March of 1889 when I stayed away from my mother's final hours. People sometimes ask what I regret most. I do not tell them the truth, which is that I regret allowing my mother to die alone while calling my name. Instead, I give them some polite answer about wishing I had traveled more or learned the piano. But the real answer is always present, steady and impossible to escape. I have often imagined that if I had gone to Cleveland, I would have watched my mother die. It would have been painful, but not impossible to bear. I might have heard her last words. I might have given her comfort. I might have forgiven her, and she might have forgiven me. I might have arranged her burial with care instead of leaving her to a poor person's grave. Yet I did none of these things, and 41 years have passed with no way to return to that moment. This is what I wish to say to anyone who listens. When someone is near death and asks for you, go if there is any way at all, even if the bond has been strained, even if anger runs deep, even if the difficulties seem too great. Go because the dead remain gone, and the chance to make peace ends with their final breath. If you do not go, you may carry that burden for the rest of your life. I did not go. I have carried that burden for 41 years, and I will carry it to my own grave, which cannot be very distant now. I hope my passing is calmer than my mother's was, though I do not truly expect it. She did not receive peace, and I feel I have not earned it either. There is a certain harsh balance in that truth, which feels both painful and fitting. That is what I came here to say.